In this episode of Home Built Workshop, I'm going to show you how I made these cool little finger joint boxes that are going to help me organize some guitar parts. Check it out. As I'm building more and more guitars, I'm finding that I need a place to help me organize the parts for each one, so I decided that I need to make some sort of little boxes that I can stage all the hardware and parts in for each build as I go. I'm going to use 1/2-inch plywood to build these boxes. My first step is just going to be to cut the pieces down to size. Alright, so that leaves me with a whole lot of little pieces that now I need to fasten together. Now I could just be super simple and just butt joint these all together, glue them up, and they would be perfectly functional, and I'm sure they would be plenty of strong. But I want to try something different that I've never tried before. We're going to do finger joints to connect these sides. In order to do the finger joints, I need to make a quick finger joint jig. Let's build one really fast. Pretty simple. Now the first thing I'm going to do before we can build this jig is I need to switch out my saw blade. Currently I have a combination blade in there which has opposite angled teeth which don't give you a flat bottom. Now that doesn't mean that this process won't work if that's the only blade you have. It will work okay, you just won't get as clean of joints because you won't get a nice square end. I've done cuts with the combination blade similar to what I'm going to do here, and all you have to do is clean up the end with a little chisel or some sandpaper or something like that just to clean it up. But I'm going to swap this blade out really quick. This blade has square teeth, so I'll get a nice flat bottom hole. Another alternative to using a blade like this would be to use a dado stack if you have one. A dado stack would have an advantage in that you could make a lot wider finger joints. This one in particular, I'm pretty well locked into 1/8-inch fingers. There we go. I'm going to do this next part using my crosscut sled. If you don't have a crosscut sled, you can do this process using a miter gauge and it should work just fine. Now I'm going to use a scrap of that same plywood and raise my blade till it's just over the thickness of the plywood. With the blade height set, using another piece of plywood as an auxiliary fence, I'll make one pass over the blade to cut a slot which will install an indexing pin. Now we need to make a small shim that is the exact thickness of this slot so that we can glue in. Now to be perfectly honest with you, I dug through my scrap pile and I found these strips of walnut that actually are the exact thickness. So this piece will work fine. If you don't happen to have a scrap that fits exactly, then it's just a little bit of trial and error, cutting some small slices on the table saw. You do want it to fit very snug because this is going to index all of the fingers that we're going to cut on this jig. It's very important that the piece does not stick out the back. This side is going to get clamped against our crosscut sled, and we want to make sure that sits nice and flush. Now all we got to do is get this thing into place. Now another option instead of using regular wood glue would be to use CA glue. That way you wouldn't have to wait for any glue to dry. It would pretty much be instant, especially if you use some accelerator, and you could just keep on going. But wood glue works fine. Let's install this. We're just going to put it in place. We're going to use a scrap of our shim as a spacer. We'll just line up our piece so that it's just barely against the blade, and we'll clamp it in place. Don't forget to remove your shim and we can test this out. The first thing I want to do is to identify which pieces will be the top. Now these are some scrap pieces. When you're making your cuts, you always want to keep the top piece toward the blade, whether it's on this side or it's on this side. And that's going to make sure that you always have your spacing go in the right direction. Now you'll probably notice that I've already made a test cut with this just to make sure I got everything right. Normally you wouldn't have this little notch already there. Your first test cut is going to go right through the fence and make a slot right there. With the top of my piece against the spacer, I'm gonna hold that securely and make my cut. If you're uncomfortable having your hand right over the blade, you could very easily put a clamp right here and it would be just fine. Now I can make some test cuts. Since I'm using plywood for this, I have found that if I bring the piece back across the blade, I get some really bad chip out. I found that I get the best results if I remove the piece before bringing it back across the blade. In my experience, this makes a huge difference in the results that I get, especially when using plywood. Now, I am sure the quality of the finger joints would improve dramatically if I used a much higher quality plywood. Something like a Baltic birch, or even some nice hardwood would eliminate the chip out. But since I already had this plywood on hand, it's what I decided to use for this project. And now I can take my piece, flip it over so that my top edge is still facing the blade. I'll drop it over my spacer, and I'll take my other side with my top edge facing the blade and butt it up against. Now I can make my first cut, remove the other piece, and finish cutting all the pieces on this side. Now when I fit these together, it's just a little bit loose, so an easy fix for that is to move my spacer away from the blade, just a teensy bit. That fits a lot better. Now it's off to the races, and I'm going to be cutting these finger joints for quite a while. Not too shabby. Now I only have to do that about 14 more times. Ah, holy cow. Look at my app. What a mess. That's a lot of sawdust. Just doing some quick math. There's 22 passes on one side. So 44 passes on one corner times 12. 44 times 12, I don't know what that is, but that's a lot of passes on the saw. Now I'm gonna drill a couple of holes that'll make up the handle of the boxes. I'm not gonna cut out the center of the handle yet, but I wanted to drill these holes while the pieces are still flat. Now I can get these things glued together. For all the fingers, I've watered down some regular yellow wood glue, and I'm just going to paint it on. This made it a lot easier to get into all the finger joints, and it seems to hold just fine. So there's one. We just need to repeat that 2 more times. Now it's just a matter of putting all these clamps away. And now that I have a better way to clamp the boxes in place, I'll use my jigsaw and cut out the center of the handles. And I'll clean up that cut using a file. Oh, the joys of hand sanding. I'm always nervous when I'm sanding plywood that I'm going to get splinters, so kind of take it easy until I know I got things nice and smooth. Or gloves. Gloves would be probably a good idea too. I've gotten some really nasty plywood splinters when hand sanding plywood before. Ooh, they hurt bad. So Be safe. Be careful when you're sanding plywood. Now for a project like this that I'm going to use in the shop, in the house, I could be just fine without putting a finish at all on here, but I do like to protect it a little bit. I'm just going to use some good old Danish oil. I can just dump it in. So here are my finished boxes. I am really happy with the way they turned out. I'm even okay with the chip out. I'll chalk it up to a learning experience. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. I have a lot of other videos, some of which will be linked right over here. You might want to check some of those out. Also, a bunch of links are in the video description, so make sure you check that out. And until next time, thanks a lot for watching.